Yeah, I will make a brief introduction of each one, which probably does not make justice to their expertise and accomplishments, but for the sake of time, allow me to be brief, please. From France, we have Mr. Hugo Devry from the Scientific Directory Team on Food, Nutrition and Bioeconomy at the National Research Institute for Agriculture, Food and Environment in RAE of France, with a specific focus on European and Mediterranean affairs concerning sustainable food and bioeconomy systems. He's also the president of the European Federation of Food Science and Technology, and is also an active member of several groups, such as the FAO-led International Sustainable Bioeconomy Working Group, and among others, of course. And lastly, he obtained a PhD in physics, and he has held several positions around the globe. Thank you, Mr. Defey, for joining us. We also have Mr. Federico Torres from the Ministry of Science, Technology and Telecommunications from Costa Rica, and coordinator of the Interministerial Bioeconomy Committee of the country. He is a member of the ad hoc International Advisory Council of the Global Bioeconomy Summit and other important international fora. He has a PhD in business economics from the University of Valencia and a postgraduate studies in information technology at the University of Salamanca, Spain. Thank you very much, Mr. Torres, for joining us. And lastly, from Malaysia, we have Mr. Timothy Ong, joining us quite late from there. Thank you so much, Timothy. He's the Vice President from the Strategic Impact Projects for Malaysia National Innovation Agency, a statutory body formerly under the purview of the Prime Minister's Department, and currently in the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation as well, after the government restructuring early in 2020. He's also an active member of the FAO-led International Sustainable Bioeconomy Working Group, and Mr. On has a master's in business administration from the University of Nottingham in England. Thank you again for joining us. I give the floor now to Adrian, who will moderate the panel. He is the Chief of the Agricultural Development and Biodiversity Unit of the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. Adrian, the floor is yours. And I stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Marta. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, so before addressing a question to each panelist, we will briefly introduce the key highlights of bioeconomy strategies that the three countries are implementing or developing. After a first half an hour, we will move to a 20 minutes question and answer session. We will have to see how the timing has been rearranged, and let me know about that. We will get questions from the audience. I kindly ask you to use the chat box to share with us any highlights and questions you may have. We go first to the case of France. France is one of the few countries in the world with a full-fledged bioeconomy action plan embedded within its bioeconomy strategy. It is often the case that actions within strategies and plans aim to respond to international environmental agreements. For example, actions to comply with the so-called multilateral environmental agreements and other mechanisms such as the UN Declaration, the Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, as it was mentioned in the previous session, the post-2020 UN Global Biodiversity Framework, or the One Health approach. A clear example is the EU Green Deal, which aims towards a zero carbon Europe in line with the Paris Agreement on climate change, and which includes bioeconomy strategies as well as EU farm to fork strategies and circular economy action plans. Within that context, I would like to ask you, Mr. Debris, to what extent do the French bioeconomy strategy and action plan consider international environmental drivers of a sustainable bioeconomy, or merely national and local drivers, and have international environmental drivers being a driver to develop the strategy used in the setup of objectives or included in the action plans. The floor is yours, Mr. Debris.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rodriguez, and also Marta Gomez. It's a great pleasure to be with you. You also put a challenge because work of more than 10 years need to be summarized in 5 minutes, but let's go ahead with it and let's give it a try. If I go back, I think the first date which is of importance is October 2014, because then the Minister for Agriculture worked out a new law on the future for agriculture, food and forestry. And this law provides a rationale for the combination of economic, environmental and social performance through sustainable and highly productive agroecological practices. And the word agroecology is now sounding or ringing a bell, which we have also seen back in the discussions with the FAO and with many others. So already this took into account what we discussed globally. I think also the work of France in the IBES, in the Biodiversity Council, as a donor since 2012, makes clear that the international drivers are well taken into account. And maybe most famously is the COP 21 in Paris in 2015 with the assignment of the agreement in 2016, which I think show the guidance and also the inspirations of France, not only at the international level, but immediately laid down in their national action plans and the PNACC, which is a clear example of that, but also on the Energy Climate Bill, which more or less made the statements to be carbon neutral in 2015, and 2050. I think also another initiative which reflects back these environmental international drivers is the 4 promille, working group, which was looking at carbon soil sequestration, how to capture carbon and how to fix it for the long term. And I think also in the discussions at the European level, our Vice President, Jean-François Suzana, he contributed much to the discussions in the mirror groups, and also as the president of the GPI, the Joint Programming Initiative, FACE, on climate and production. If we look more to the water sector, there is a new strategy just launched in 2020 for the coming 10 years on water and sanitation, which also has an international focus directly, and for example, also in the Mediterranean, if we see it back in PRIMA. If I then go more to your principle 5, as defined by the FAO and the resource use efficiency, in 2017, France has defined its strategy with 6 priority themes, which were more or less assuring that bio-based products we can see back in the market, the guidance of the transitions to a bioeconomy, a sustainable production of bioresources, not for one value chain, but for multiple ones, the guarantee that the bioeconomy should be sustainable, communicated also with the wider public, and innovate for a performing bioeconomy. That were 6 ambitions. Those are now updated more or less in detail, but I will only say 2 words on it. It is on a global pillar based and on a local pillar based. Global, that takes into account all the international drivers, but local, trying to see how local bioeconomy systems can become sustainable. And this is to guarantee to have an involvement of the citizens in the local communities, which links directly the environmental dimension to the social one. So that is what is now laid down in a report, which can be downloaded. I can send a link to it. And it is linked to the action plan 2018-2020 with 6 major actions. I'll come back to that in a second. Before saying that also your principle on food waste is a key one, because France is ranked #1 by the Food Sustainability Index. for their collective efforts to reduce food waste. I think that's an important point that is laid down now in 36 action points, which are well followed, I think. The final words I like to say is on the National Bioeconomy Action Plan itself. That has 5 priorities. The first is increasing knowledge about bioeconomy, and we are very happy also to share the efforts that we do on the international basis via the Bioeconomy Colloque, which will be for the next time organized next year. And we are very happy to invite you there. The second is to promote the bioeconomy and its products for a wider public. And the third is the creation of favorable conditions that offers or that links offers and demands, which is a key challenge, of course, if we look to how to valorize our byproducts, which are often under-valorized or not valorized at all. The fourth action is to produce, mobilize, and transform bioresources sustainably, which you have seen in the strategy, but this is asking a lot of innovations which are supported. And finally, take away the hurdles and mobilize budget, not at the state level only, but as a common stakeholder activity. With that, I think I've already said too much, so I give back the floor, but I hope it gives a little bit in 5 minutes a view on the actions in front.
Thank you, Mr. Debris. Great job in summarizing in 5 minutes 10 years work, and especially since October 2014. You mentioned agroecology. Agroecology is a dear issue for us at ECLAC and FAO. We are in ECLAC pursuing the idea of a agroecological transition within the context of the bioeconomy. So we go now to Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a world leader in biodiversity conservation and its sustainable use, as you may all know. Biodiversity and development is one of the 5 pillars of Costa Rica's recently released Bioeconomy Strategy, one of the few released strategies this year, along with Germany and East African countries. Besides tackling negative impacts on the environment, the Costa Rican strategy takes a proactive approach by promoting environmental action and addressing the role of biodiversity and as a long-term opportunity for sustainable development. The biodiversity pillar of the strategy aims to enhance ecosystem services and the sustainable use of terrestrial and marine biodiversity resources as a new engine for inclusive, sustainable development with high value added and low greenhouse emissions. Within that context, Mr. Torres, I would like to ask you, which policy tools have you considered in your strategy to foster conservation, to promote ecosystem services, and to enhance the equitable and sustainable use of biodiversity for the bioeconomy? How they address job creation and green COVID-19 recovery when it comes to conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity? The floor is yours. The screen is yours, I would say, Mr. Torres.
Thank you very much. I am very glad to be here and share with you our efforts in develop this strategy for my country. First of all, as you mentioned, the strategy is pretty new. We launched this strategy in August. We are working in this moment in the action plans for the different regions of Costa Rica. In this process, obviously, I have to commend that Costa Rica has a long history in policies and regulation directly related with environmental protection and decarbonization. For example, in 2018, we launched, the president of my country launched a decarbonization policy and plan to develop and coordinate our governmental efforts in pursue the environmental protection and the decarbonization. In this case, with our strategy, we will pursue, emphasize a business orientation in the development of these processes, and provide the enhancement for a big jump for sustainability in Costa Rica. We are working in different lines, as you mentioned, in different axes. And in this axis, we collect the action lines that we can develop to implement our efforts, pursuing obviously the recovery of Costa Rica after the COVID-19. Obviously, we don't have, we didn't develop the plan before COVID-19. We developed this strategy before COVID-19. We don't have, as all many people in the world, our country doesn't have a plan for this. It's impossible. But in this moment, we consider the strategy of bioeconomy is a very good policy to accomplish our objectives, to recover our economy and give to my country the opportunity to jump to sustainability in this process. For example, in Axis 1 of our strategy, we collect and establish different action lines for sustainable fishing and aquaculture. This is very important for us because Costa Rica is 92% water. That is the real thing if you consider our territorial sea. And it's very important for us the development of the marine economy, and we are accomplish different institutional and intersectoral efforts to transform our very traditional sectors of fishing and agriculture to sustainable and high technology processing industries in this area. We share specific lines in our strategy aiming the sustainable use of biodiversity and the promotion of ecosystem services. This strategy represents a clear framework in which to develop an action plan that allows promoting sustainable development. We think with this strategy, we pursue economic development without over-exploiting the planet resources is what the bioeconomy has to promote, we think, and is what the Costa Rican strategy seeks. Continue doing businesses and promoting economical growth, but we have a very high commitment with a vision of environmental sustainability, recognition of the limits of the planet, and develop a vision in our country of a circular use of biomass. In the, as the panelists of France comment before, we are working very hard in communication about bioeconomy as them, because in this moment, a very important thing in the development of this kind of strategies, the communication of society. We have to take advantage of the importance that science have in this moment in our countries, and to give to our citizens the knowledge about what is bioeconomy, what is the importance of knowledge in bioeconomy, of technology and science in bioeconomy, how the biotechnology sector, for example, in medical areas or agricultural areas can transform our economies and support our development in the next years. This is a process because difficult but very important, because in the case of Costa Rica, there are very traditional sectors in the economy, and we have to transform these sectors to take advantage of our capacities in R&D and our capacities in bio and nanotechnologies and development in genetics and omics and omic sciences, because Costa Rica has some capacities in these areas, but the linkage between the R&D sector and the innovations sector of my country, the innovation system in my country is weak in this moment. We are working very hard in these topics to develop in the different regions of Costa Rica a proposal to transform and give to the country these linkages between the different sectors. A new innovation system with new capacities to transform our economy in a bioeconomy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Torres. Thank you for sharing with us. I would stress what you have said about the linking between knowledge and new technologies, where Costa Rica has strength with complementing the richness in biological resources that the country has. Now we want to discuss about environmental footprint issues, including bio-industrial activities in the case of Malaysia. You know, Mr. Ong, in order for those activities to succeed, it is important to have an industrial infrastructure in place for providing the enable environment to the economic transformation towards a bioeconomy, as we are seeing in Malaysia with the circular bioeconomy model. However, sustainable and circular practices such as industrial symbiosis should be in place to reduce trade-offs between the socioeconomic dimension and the environment. Mr. Ong, can you provide us with examples of concrete measures from Malaysian bioeconomy related to environmental protection, in particular, for example, runoff of pollutants and greenhouse emissions from bioindustrial activities? And in what ways do circular practices contribute to air, water, and soil pollution? Back to you, Mr. Ong.
Hello, yes, thank you. So in essence of time control, I guess I would have approximately 5 to 7 minutes, right? If I'm correct.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, sure. So, but I'd love to give a little bit backdrop before addressing that question on the environmental protection issue. That I think Malaysia is one of the first countries back in 2005 to actually have a national biotechnology policy, right? I think that was when it started. Like many countries, it started from an economic development angle, where biotechnology was used, or what you know today as bioeconomy was used back then interchangeably, right? So with that, over the years, I would say that it has evolved, right, in many aspects, even as recent as 2014, 2015, where we started to have a revision of that document, and subsequently a strategy on the bio residues or waste streams of those agricultural activities that we have to address issues such as emissions, environmental sustainability, and I think if a lot of people understand, or at least in the European context, sustainability, it's a major component now, for the Malaysian agricultural sector, especially in the palm oil industry, where it is something that it's highly controversial globally, right? Where we talked about issues like deforestation. So I wouldn't even take that as a way of addressing it. It's part and parcel of that industry itself. So in that context, a lot of these economic activities driven by bioeconomy will have to take that into context, because Malaysia is in a very shy position where we don't have a sufficient local market or a captive market, and we rely a lot on exports of products, right? Whether it's as a product of the bioeconomy or even any products that we have in Malaysia, there is a very strong export market, and a lot of these markets today are driven pretty much on the sustainability, both in terms of the environmental aspect, in terms of social aspects, as well as basically covering all your ESG components into the context. So if you ask me, how do we address this, I would plug now very specific examples that a lot of these projects that we develop on ground, barring aside what the strategy actually says, it's driven purely a lot of them are purely driven by the environmental sustainability aspects, right? For instance, I think that the more recent projects that you will be able to see, I think it's in public domain information, the BioHub Pod project in the island of Borneo in Sarawak. If you looked at the core principle of that project itself, it's really based on a few things, right? I could stress on, as project developers, growing the biodiversity is one of the key elements of the project. The environmental sustainability, the carbon neutrality of those projects, the environmental aspects such as what you mentioned around environmental protection, on wastewater management of those projects. All those are key components of that project that, although we don't explicitly state, in a bannerized format, but it is a core principle of that development itself. So I think does that I would like to pause for a bit because Adrian, does that address that first portion of your question, which is how do we concretely do that, right? I think that those are one of the questions. And the thing is, in Malaysia, we do actually, if you look at the progression of the national economic agenda or the national vision and agenda that we have launched last year, 2019, and then that's something that stretches all the way to 2030. Sustainability is one of the key 6 trusts as far as the development pillars of the country is concerned. I think that's a public domain information that you could actually look at, and sustainability is a major component of that. And on top of that, there is 6 different ways of looking at monitoring those performance. And I think one of the key recommendations in that document was the availability of a sustainability and climate change index, right? So of course, we are not yet ready to launch that, but I mean, that is actually included as one of the major 6 monitoring tools, one of the 6, right? So I think on top of all the others like economic, the social sustainability aspects and stuff. So it has gone from something that is purely economic driven to something that has gone mainstream in the economic development of the country. And you are seeing it in multiple shapes and forms in the workings or the daily workings of the different ministries and agencies. And of course, well, besides the federal level, buy-in on this idea on circularity and environmental sustainability, the other key thing is at the state and provincial level, of which all of them have got autonomy to actually develop their own economic plans. It's heavily featured in a lot of these different state development plans. So to me, that's been addressed in all the multiple aspects of the country development. And I'm seeing this very, very aggressively during the COVID-19 and post-COVID. I wouldn't say post, hopefully post-COVID-19 would remain that same momentum. But I mean, this is something that we see increasingly being very strongly played out. And unfortunately, a lot of these end markets or the offerings that we talked about, these are the basic criteria to be in the ball game, right, for us as a country. So I don't think it's something that we can take an option, or it's not a binary option for us. It's something that we have to take into account in order to be sustainable in the long term, right? So I hope this gives you a little bit in terms of what we see, how we see it, and how that is being put into national, provincial development plans that will help drive this. So we do have aggressive commitments as far as carbon emissions concerned. We follow that closely. I think the last that we've checked is 45% reduction emissions. So that's aligned to and still consistent with what we pledged for. So I mean, hopefully this gives you an idea in terms of what we're doing in Malaysia. I'll be happy to share a lot more and share the documents that list all those environmental aspects of the development projects that we are doing currently. Yeah, so if you're expecting slowness in speech or you think hanging off is largely because of the broadband speed that I have here in Malaysia, or it's because it's way past my bedtime. So either one, right? So yeah. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ong. You pointed something important. Bioeconomy is not a zero-sum game, so you have to be integral in approaching, going from the economic purely aspects, as you mentioned, into the monitoring in a comprehensive way, including environmental and social concerns. And please, for you and the other panelists, you could share with us any documents that you may deem relevant to share with the audience and after the session. We have from the audience a question that I would like to ask to each of you. We have here 3 different countries with different experiences, different policies, different policy timelines. Those are countries that are in some sense leaders in Europe, Asia, and Europe in terms of developing policies for the bioeconomy. So I would like to ask each of you if you could provide some key lessons to countries or regions that are working towards the establishment of bioeconomy strategies. One recommendation, one learned lesson from the process followed in your country. So we will start with Mr. De Vries, and then without further interruptions, you could go Federico and Mr. Ong.
Okay, thank you very much also for this interesting question. I never know if you are before or beyond the others. That is a difficult question to answer. I think we are all, based on our context, on track, and maybe we like to speed up the processes all. What are the lessons that I like to share with you? I think there are, in such a process, there are for me 4 key observations. The first is sharing of best but also worst practices, not only telling but visualizing what you are doing. So make a kind of vitrine of the good examples and show why it's good or why it didn't work. Be honest in that. The second is having a kind of a common conceptual framework or speaking a same language. That is in the bioeconomy something which is not so easy. We all have to start. Some are still speaking about the biotechnology bioeconomy, others are about the resources bioeconomy, others about the socio-ecological bioeconomy. What do we mean with it? And do we have a kind of a framework in which we can all place our discussions? Not to do the same everywhere because the contexts are different, but to speak at least the same language. The third is to have a standardized process in which we monitor progress. So do we have the same scenarios in mind? Do we have the same then priorities based on those scenarios in mind? And how do we transform them in actions? And then I come to the 4th point, have a kind of a working procedure that makes visible that we can do it jointly. In the bioeconomy, everything is intersector, everything is interdisciplinary, everything also means that we cannot do it by ourselves. If we think that we can focus on one value chain and beat the others in the traditional sectors, we can forget it. I think we certainly have to look to the diversity of our resources, to diverse sectors, and thus we need diverse experts, both in the public and in the private domain. So work it out as joint teams. That are more or less the 4 lessons that if I can share something with you, that is what I like to share.
Thank you, Mr. Debris. Mr. Torres?
Thank you very much for the question. It's a very interesting question and we think it's very important to underline the holistic view of the economy, the interdisciplinarity, as mentioned as the previous panelist. In the development of our strategy, those topics are very important for get success. Because you need an interdisciplinary view to collect the force of the different institutions. The transformation of the economy of one country depends on collect a lot of efforts and a lot of intersectoral alliances. And I think this holistic view and this interdisciplinary view make it easier to collect those efforts. The second lesson that I want to underline is you need to balance an urban and rural vision for build in our countries. For example, the countries as Costa Rica, we have a lot of differences between the rural and urban, especially in many countries, and working with that is very important in these processes. Obviously, it's important to mention in our case, we have an access, the fifth axis of our strategy is biocities. The concept of biocities is a very important concept. And I think it's important to keep this balance between the rural and the urban vision in the process of development of the strategy. The third lesson that we want to underline is the role of the businesses. The role of the business is central, of the firms is central in the development of the strategy. The strategy is in our case, is for them, is for the private sector, the academic sector, and the public sector is working to transform all the economy, all the lives of our country, and for that we need the private sector is working with us from the beginning. And the fourth lesson that we want to present or share in this activity is the importance of the information technology and data science. It's very important to have a very good indicators about the progress. We are building this moment an bioeconomy observatory in our country to collect all the information of the country and measure our progress. For us, it's very important to get this tool to develop the action plans and to show to the society the progress in our strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Torres. Mr. Ong.
Yes, I would not want to repeat, right, what's been mentioned. Obviously, all those points are valid. The inclusive development will be one very key lesson that that we've learned, because different parts, unfortunately, if you looked at the context of Malaysia, it's the same thing, right? We have different parts of Malaysia having different bioeconomic potential, and in many cases you see states with the highest potential are probably the poorest states with a lot of access to even basic infrastructure is being deprived. So obviously, there is a disparity in terms of that, in growing those economies. But I think if there's one thing that we want to talk about, a sustainable bioeconomy, obviously the inclusive development will have to be one key aspect of it. And of course, I would echo the sentiments on deployment of technology, especially data technology. I mean, in the projects that we are working on with industry today, as far as pushing that whole circular model is concerned. One key aspect of making the entire value chain fully transparent and traceable is the deployment of IoT systems, AI, data science, and etc. We are already looking into the future generation refineries, because where every input and output from this particular biomanufacturing facility, it's being captured and in real time, right? So this is some of those elements that that we see that is very important, because it's no use if we have an information that we need to use a year or two together and then try to make decision upon it, because that would be history, right? One of those key elements is the informed decision making when you want to drive a particular decision on bioeconomy. Okay, so those are the things, and these are some of the learnings that we see that's important, or to add on top of what the panelists have just mentioned. And of course, the buy-in from the business community is one very key element, because within government, you only have a limited capability to drive the entire ecosystem, right? And you really need all the stakeholders to be bought in. And if we work our way starting from industry or collaboratively with industry, you would actually make the entire process a little bit less painful, I would say, right? Because a lot of these investments into infrastructure, buying in of ideals, will have to come to them eventually, right? And it would be a very difficult task if we try to build something without the involvement and then try to enforce upon implementation, because then a lot of these flaws and cracks, a lot of the gray areas in the policy will be exploited, right? Because they are not part of that process. So I mean, those are just the couple of things that over the years that we've tried to work something on. Are feedbacks from industry, are some learnings within government that we felt, and of course the capability of the civil service and the government to understand why is it important that sustainability is a centerpiece of this whole circular bioeconomy. Right? I think everyone would have to do that. You're not just government administrators; you are driven by passion and of course with an objective in mind. I think that would make heaps of difference as far as the effectiveness of certain policies concerned, right? So I mean that sums up my part. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ong. I think we will have to put a stop to our passion here. We are getting the call to go back to the main room. Unfortunately, we will not have time for more questions. So I give the word back to Marta. Over to you, Marta.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Just briefly, yes, we would like to thank you, of course, very much for this discussion. And we will go now back to the plenary room where the country experts will share some highlights on what was discussed in the different breakout groups, and in particular on policies to reduce the trade-offs and enhance synergies between the 4 pillars of sustainability. But before, we will have a 15-minute coffee break. What you can do is to leave this Zoom open in case you want to come back here, and let's go now to the big blue button up to hear some housekeeping notes, and in 15 minutes we will all gather there again. So I will leave this open as well in case someone else wants to stay. But for the moment, let's move to the other one.